To those affected by mitochondrial disorders, UMDF is here for you. Since 1996, we've worked to provide support, fund research, and create awareness.
Our mission is to promote research for cures and treatments of these diseases and to give support to affected families.
We want future generations to grow up in a world without mitochondrial disease.
I'm playing for the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation.
Look at that. Nice check for you.
Over the years, our community has grown and our message has sparked a movement.
Hey everybody, it's Maya Mialnik. Have you ever heard of mitochondrial disease?
Together, we've been able to make a difference for patient families around the world. Today, we are helping thousands of people navigate their mitochondrial disease journey. We're here, listening and providing support. We're here, educating and connecting patients and healthcare providers. We're here, finding and funding the best cutting-edge research. We will not rest until we find a cure. Join the movement at umdf.org.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Ask the Mito Doc. Tonight's webcast topic is drug development for mitochondrial disease, lessons learned. This Ask the Mito Doc webcast is presented by Dr. Matthew Klein. Dr. Klein is Chief Development Officer with PTC Therapeutics. Moderating this evening's webcast is UMDF Science and Alliance Officer, Dr. Phil Yeske. Now, before we hear from our panel, we do have some housekeeping items for you. We've added QR codes to each slide, so don't hesitate to scan them with your phone. It will open your browser to the specific resource. Under View Options at the top of your screen, we ask that you select Side-by-Side mode. This is so the presentation will fit on your screen. We have muted the lines, so if during this webcast you may have a question, use the Q&A button to type your question in and we'll try to get you answers. We also ask that you keep your questions focused on tonight's topic. Please understand that we can't answer all of the questions through this forum, and the question that you may ask may not be asked the way you posed it. If you're having technical issues, we invite you to raise your hand, and the staff will respond through chat. Also, please note that closed captioning is available, and you can control that option in your menu. Our Ask the Mito Doc webcasts are made possible through the generosity of these sponsors. Please join us in thanking them for their support. 2021 is UMDF's silver anniversary, and throughout the year, we're going to have special memories on our website and through our social media channels, so we invite you to view each. We also want to tell you about updates we've made to our coronavirus resources webpage, specifically the upcoming vaccine distribution and the impact on our patients and families. Also, make sure you check out MitoU. Now, this is a great resource for patient families and our scientific and medical community. It provides you with helpful information on diagnosis, treatments, and it's continually updated with informational videos for your viewing, including the archives of these Ask the Mito Doc webcasts. As you might expect, and out of abundance of caution for our patient families and scientists and clinicians, Mitochondrial Medicine 2021 will be virtual this year. We will begin on June 24th and end on June 26th. And we invite you to check out the UMDF Symposium webpage for updates and for schedules and registration information. We also want to let you know about the important programs that UMDF has been conducting for 25 years, and that is our patient support. We have the availability to connect you to one of our 90-plus ambassadors around the country or through the hundreds of support meetings we hold throughout the year. So please reach out if you need support. You can contact us anytime at 888-900-6486. Also, our Energy for Life walkathons are getting underway. Walk your way this spring safely. You can find a walk location near you at walk your way at energyforlifewalk.org. And looking ahead, we will have 2 Ask the Mito Doc panels during the symposium this June. We will start up again in the fall, but for now, we invite you to check out this lineup of those panels coming up during Mitochondrial Medicine 2021 virtual. But for now, let's get things started for this edition of Ask the Mito Doc. as we turn things over to our moderator for this webcast, Dr. Phil Yeski.
Hello, everyone, and very nice to be here with you this evening. I will be the moderator for tonight's Ask the Mito Doc. As you heard, we're going to have a presentation by Dr. Matthew Klein of PTC Therapeutics. He's the Chief Development Officer there. But I think for most on this call, they know Matt a much longer time period than just with PTC Therapeutics from his time at Edison Pharmaceuticals and then BioElectron. So it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome Matt tonight, thank him in advance for sharing some of his insights on lessons learned over a decade of drug development for mitochondrial disease. And when Matt wraps up, we're going to have a moderated Q&A session. So as mentioned in the introductory video, please place your questions into the Q&A function and we'll do the best we can to get to as many of them as possible. So without further ado, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you and learn something about the lessons learned over the past decade.
Great, thank you very much, Phil. Let me call up my slides here and share with everyone. It's truly a pleasure to be here tonight and have this opportunity to speak with you and the mitochondrial disease community. I've been working towards developing drugs for people affected by mitochondrial disease for over a decade. And when I started in the field in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, things were really different than they were today. There really weren't any other drug development programs in existence. There was not a lot of activity in this field. There was a lot of laboratory research and a lot of great ideas, but there weren't a lot of clinical trials going on, and there hadn't been a lot of clinical trials completed. And that had a lot of important challenges for us to navigate as we entered the field. I think the great news is we've come such a long way as a community. You can look at the pipeline page on the UMD website and see there's a number of active trials going on and many more to come. So we're really now in an era where clinical trials in mitochondrial disease is more common. And it's our hope and our expectation that there'll be more and more. And of course, the more trials there are, the more chances there are to having a successful therapy and have treatments for patients with mitochondrial disease. But tonight I wanted to take everyone through some of the lessons that I've learned along the way, some key learnings from over a decade of clinical development work in inherited mitochondrial disease. And what I wanted to do is really start by talking about the ideal attributes of a disease when you think about drug development. So when you have a drug or developing a therapy that might be effective for a disease, one thing we do is we look at a particular disease and say, does it meet these typical criteria we like to see? And those criteria are one, homogeneous populations or subpopulations. Is there a group of patients within a disease that have a common genotype or phenotype, set of symptoms, rate of progression? That's really important. Second is natural history. Is there a really well understood natural history of a disease's course from its beginnings or from when it's diagnosed to its end stage, including how rapidly a person may move through the stages of a disease? Are there objective metrics of disease? Can we easily measure what's going on with an individual's disease, including symptoms, severity of disease, and also do we have measurements of the disease that may respond to an intervention or a treatment? Next, are there accessible populations? Are there enough people to participate in the trial? If we design a clinical trial for a particular drug or therapy, you need to make sure that there's enough participants so we can answer the question, is the therapy safe and effective? And finally, is there a precedent for drug approval? It's a much easier path if someone's been down the road before. If they've set up a lot of the important elements for a drug development program, that's obviously attractive. It makes it easier then to develop another drug if one's already been developed. And so when we ask to what extent does mitochondrial disease meet these criteria, unfortunately, we see not too well. Mitochondrial disease is not homogeneous. It's actually quite heterogeneous and probably one of the most heterogeneous diseases there is. In terms of natural history, certainly when we started over a decade ago, there really was not very good natural history. Now, there's a lot of really important efforts underway now that are making that better. A lot of work going into this, but really we still don't have the comprehensive natural histories that we need to guide successful drug development programs. Objective metrics of disease, there really weren't any. And we still are struggling to find really reliable measurements of disease that we can use in clinical trials. In terms of accessible population, of course, well, when you look at mitochondrial disease as a whole, it's quite common, but each individual disease subtype or genetic mutation may be quite rare. And finally, precedent for drug approval. And unfortunately, as we know, today there are no approved therapies for targeting mitochondrial disease. And so we're not there yet. So we don't quite have that precedent that would be very helpful. And I just wanted to spend an extra minute on why that's so important. If you don't have an approved therapy, you don't have an established pathway forward for developing a drug. For example, if you were developing a drug for high blood pressure or diabetes, it's very clear what a phase 1 trial would look like, what a phase 2 trial would look like, what a phase 3 trial would look like. But we don't quite yet have those models for clinical trials that are tailored to studying mitochondrial disease. There's also a lack of validated endpoints. And by validated endpoints, I mean measurements that we put into a clinical trial that say, did the therapy make a patient better? Did the therapy make a difference? And there's a whole process that measurement would have to go through in order to be called a validated endpoint. But that's something very important in terms of increasing the likelihood of having a successful trial. And it's also something very important for regulatory authorities like the FDA in the United States or the EMA in Europe. So not having those poses some real challenges in a drug development program. There's also not as much excitement about participating in clinical trials when there's not already approved therapies. It's much easier for people to believe that participating in a trial is worthwhile if they can see a model of success. And finally, without approved therapies, there's a lot of additional work needed for patients and families, for investigators, and understanding that when you do a clinical trial, it's much different than clinical care. When you're in a trial, it's not simply just going to the doctor and getting a therapy, you're getting a prescription. There's actually a lot involved that makes it very different. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the talk. And the other important component is there's also education needed for regulatory authorities. You know, in the early days of our work in mitochondrial disease over 10 years ago, you would have meetings with regulatory authorities and they just couldn't give you as much meaningful guidance as you might, one, receive today, but also might receive for another drug for which they've seen many development programs before. You know, I think informed, experienced regulatory authorities are much more productive partners than when you have a disease that they don't really have a lot of experience with. So when we started, that was the landscape, and we basically had, two options, in terms of handling those challenges. Do you hold off on starting a clinical trial until all that work is done, until we have natural history studies, till we have validated endpoints? Or do you say, look, people with mitochondrial disease can't wait. The disease isn't waiting for us to figure all this out. Why don't we move forward, understand that there's challenges, but still move forward and be prepared to learn and evolve? And that was the decision we made over a decade ago when we started our first clinical trials. And that's still a decision a lot of us make today. We say we have a promising therapy, we want to study it, we want to get it to patients as quickly as possible and prove that it's safe and effective. So in doing that, we learned a lot of important lessons along the way. And so I'll run through these lessons one by one, but let me present them to you first. 1, don't confuse rare with homogeneous. 2, accurate and comprehensive natural history is critical. 3, biomarkers are needed to facilitate all stages of development. 4, objective metrics of disease are better endpoints than composite scales. 5, short trials lead to long delays. 6, an aggregated patient community is critical to patient recruitment. 7, it's important to engage with regulatory authorities early and often. And 8, all of these challenges are actually exacerbated by disease rarity and some barriers that may exist in traveling to study sites. So let me run through each of these one by one and talk a little bit about them. First, don't confuse rare with homogeneous. And this was something that Amy Goldstein, who's at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, said to me years ago, and wow, it's so true. I think people often have the misconception that just because a disease is rare, that it will be homogeneous. And that's definitely not true in mitochondrial disease. There's a great deal of heterogeneity or variety in mitochondrial disease. There's genetic heterogeneity. As we know, mitochondrial disease can arise from mutations in the mitochondria's own DNA, or it can arise from mutations in the nuclear DNA. That right there is a source of big difference. And then, of course, there's the concept of heteroplasmy, which is really unique to mitochondrial disease and leads to heterogeneity as well. There's also phenotypic or disease heterogeneity. So you can have two individuals who have the same exact genotype, maybe even the same exact mutation, but can have a different disease course. Different organ systems could be affected, the severity of symptoms could be different, and the rate of progression of the disease can be different. So there's a lot of room for variability in patients with mitochondrial disease, and that poses a challenge when we think about designing clinical trials. So what happens is we're forced to make some choices. How do we deal with that heterogeneity? Well, if you say you want to still study, for example, Lee syndrome SIRF1, that's one defined population, but there still may be extreme heterogeneity in terms of rate of symptom progression, the symptoms that are present, and that can actually, again, have an impact on a clinical trial. It's also very hard to establish relationships between one specific genotype and a phenotype. It's hard to say if you have this genetic mutation, you're going to have this kind of clinical disease, and we're going to better understand who's going to respond to a drug or not based on that genotype and phenotype. Due to the variety in the two, it's hard to do that. And one possible way forward, which we've taken and others, is to focus on a common symptom and say, okay, while the overall syndrome may be have a lot of variability, while a specific genetic mutation may be heterogeneous, maybe we'll just focus on a specific symptom like myopathy or seizures and really study that symptom and include patients with all different genetic mutations. And that's one path forward that, again, we've taken and a number of others are taking as well. Lesson 2, accurate and comprehensive natural history is critical. And when we talk about a natural history of a disease, it's really a detailed study of what happens to individuals who have that disease. How is it diagnosed? What are the symptoms at time of diagnosis? And what's the course of that disease? Which symptoms get worse? Which symptoms may get better? Do symptoms get better and worse? Do they fluctuate and go up and down? All of that is part of a natural history. And initially, what we had for mitochondrial disease were really just single case reports or descriptions of one patient or two patients, not really comprehensive studies of a large number of patients with a specific mitochondrial disease subtype. And that's a problem for us because if we don't understand the disease for the majority of people with that disease, it makes us hard to know what to include in a clinical trial in terms of understanding what can get better, what can improve. And it also makes it hard to understand which patients we should select for a clinical trial because every clinical trial has a set of what's known as inclusion criteria, which we're required to do in developing a drug. And it's hard to do that if you don't understand what to include and exclude because we don't understand the entirety of the disease. The other thing that's really important is to understand disease progression and how a disease takes its course in the context of good care. There's been so many tremendous strides made in the quality of mitochondrial disease care. There's so many excellent physicians and centers around this country. And natural history or studies of patients from 10, 20 years ago, or even 25, 30 years ago, don't really reflect what's going on today. And so you may get a not an accurate understanding of the disease because the care has changed for the better. And finally, of the limited natural history, while it's good to have natural history, we also have to remember that we don't know how patients are going to behave in a clinical trial. When you come into a clinical trial, you can receive and often there's a placebo-controlled phase, which means that if you can receive either the drug being studied or a placebo that looks a lot like the drug, may even taste like the drug, but it doesn't have the active part of the drug. And that's a very important element of a clinical trial that we're often required to have to demonstrate clearly that a therapy is having a benefit to patients. And just being in a trial, we know, can change someone's disease symptoms, whether they're getting a drug or a placebo. And so that's really important to understand, and it's something we can't always get from a natural history. And I just wanted to spend one more minute talking about this importance of understanding disease progression in the context of optimal care, because what happens for a clinical trial is that it may also be the first time that an individual with mitochondrial disease gets to a specialized center where you may have exposure to nutritional support and physical therapy. So while you're enrolling in a clinical trial, not only you're either receiving placebo or the study drug, but you also may be getting much better overall care, whether it be through the help of a nutritionist, nursing, medicine, or physical therapy. And so it's important for us when we design a clinical trial to make sure the only thing we're studying is the effect of the drug on the disease, not the drug and any new supportive care that an individual may receive just by entering the clinical trial. Next, lesson 3, biomarkers are needed for all development stages. And this is really important in helping guide both the preclinical, before a drug gets into the clinic, and clinical development. We have a lot of research going on to identify biomarkers. Those are markers of disease that tell us a lot about the underlying disease process. They're helpful in the preclinical stage to have us have confidence that we have a drug that may work in patients. It also allows us to understand what a specific dose level, the effect of a specific dose level may have on that marker of disease, what we call in drug development PK/PD models. In the clinic, having biomarkers also allows us to identify subgroups within a disease population. It may help us understand who with a specific disease like MELAS or POLG may be more likely to respond to a particular therapy than others. If we had a blood test, for example, or a radiology test that told us how the drug is acting and also reflected the disease, it allows us to start to understand which patients may be more likely to respond, and also helps us better design clinical trials. Next, objective metrics are better than composite scales. And this is talking about when we have endpoints in a clinical trial. As I mentioned, the endpoints are those measurements we use in a clinical trial that help us tell whether or not a drug is having a good effect on the disease. And when we develop drugs, we can use many different types of endpoints. And what are often used are scales, rating scales that include a number of different symptoms and signs of disease. And it turns out for many diseases, that's all we have. Now, many of these scales that exist weren't necessarily developed for clinical trials. They were really developed as staging scales, or things that you could administer to an individual maybe once a year or once every 2 years or once every 3 or 4 years, something over the course of a disease that can tell you that if the disease is progressing or not. Well, the problem with that is a clinical trial is often only 6 months or a year. And so if you have an assessment that only maybe changes once every year or once every 2 years, that's not a very good way to tell if a drug is having an effect in 6 months or 12 months. And also many of the scales that may exist in neurology or pediatrics may not have been developed for mitochondrial disease patients. So they may not really capture elements that are particularly relevant to people with mitochondrial disease. Also, when you use scales, if 2 different people administer the scale, they may rate you different. If you have a question and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and you have to rate someone on a scale of 1 to 4, well, one evaluator may think something's a 4, and another one may think it's a 3. That's really problematic if you're trying to really understand in a very precise way the effect of a drug on disease. And sometimes there's even an individual may rate things differently and not remember how they rated something the last time. So if at the beginning of the trial, me as a physician, I grade something a 4, and then the next time it's a 3 or a 4, and I can't remember what I thought a 4 was before, Well, that increases a lot of variability and again, impacts our ability to determine whether or not a drug is working. And finally, it's also sometimes difficult to capture the true impact on how an individual feels or functions with their disease in everyday life. And that concept of feel or function is something the FDA really wants to understand. When we go to the FDA and say, we have an application for approval for a drug, they want to know that that drug clearly improved the way an individual, as they say, feels and functions in everyday life. And sometimes if you go and you say, hey, we use this scale, like the Newcastle mitochondrial disease scale in our clinical trial, and we showed that patients on drug got better by 3 points, their response is, we don't know what it means to be better by 3 points. If you told us that you actually have someone who can exercise for longer or walk a greater distance over a period of time, or you improve speech, or you delay the amount of time it takes that someone may end up in a wheelchair, or you decrease the number of times someone's in the hospital, they know that that's really meaningful. And those are the kinds of things that the FDA would look for in understanding whether or not they should approve a drug. And this is a particularly interesting challenge in mitochondrial disease, because one of the things that we like about these scales that the regulatory agencies don't like is they're actually really good at capturing the complexity of mitochondrial disease. If you have a scale that assesses many different symptoms, that's really good, because we know that patients with mitochondrial disease have different symptoms, different disease organ systems may be involved. And this is actually one way we can be sure that if we have 2 patients with a different disease course and different symptoms and different severity, we can make sure that we have something that would capture a drug effect on both of them. So we have a little bit of a balancing act that we have to play in picking a disease scale that might be really helpful for mitochondrial disease patients, but at the same time may not meet the standards that, say, the FDA would want for us to have as an endpoint for a drug approval trial. It also turns out that some of the natural history work that's been done in some diseases is really based on these rating scales. So the data we do have, the natural history we do have to help inform a clinical trial design may be using a scale that the regulatory authorities may not like. So that really poses a lot of challenges for us as we think about setting up a clinical trial and picking those important endpoints. Next is the concept of short trials and long delays. And this is one we deal with a lot. And I remember when we designed our first clinical trials, 9 or so, 10 years ago, this was something we thought about a lot about. Patients with severe disease, patients with mitochondrial disease, don't want to go on placebo because, if there's a drug that might help, why would we delay access to a drug or studying the drug in someone who's got a really progressive and serious disease? Well, of course, it's something that's really required of us in many cases to have a placebo-controlled trial. And so we say, okay, let's minimize that duration of exposure to placebo. Also, if the trial is shorter, maybe we'll get a positive trial sooner and get an approval sooner, and we can make the drug available to more people sooner. And then also for companies, a shorter trial is less expensive than a larger trial. And this is really an important consideration for smaller companies. Many of the companies involved in mitochondrial disease development are small private companies where these budget considerations are really, really important. Well, while that rationale is really clear and makes a lot of sense, the reality is a little bit different. It turns out we need longer trials. Longer trials are important because one, it allows a greater time to see if a drug is really having a meaningful effect on the disease. Also, when we think about heterogeneous diseases and patients progressing at different rates, if you have a longer study, it just allows you more time to understand if you're having an effect on an individual's disease, even if it's progressing very slowly. Also, if a first trial is too short and it's not positive, and you have to do another trial, well, it turns out you actually haven't shortened the time at all, because having to think again about starting another trial and getting ready and designing it and talking to the FDA and the EMA in Europe and getting all the investigator sites ready and getting all the paperwork done takes a really long time. And so if you go quickly to finish a trial thinking you're going to get to approval sooner, you may actually end up delaying things longer than if you just did a longer, more appropriate trial to start with. And again, that's a lesson we've learned in many different ways. Next, aggregated and engaged patient community is critical to trial enrollment. Everything about clinical trials, and especially clinical trials in mitochondrial disease, it's a team sport. It's a partnership. It's a partnership between patients and families and foundations and advocacy groups and physicians and researchers and companies. It is absolutely a team sport. And the only way we can have successful trials and get therapies to patients is in a collaborative effort, in a partnership. And also, is this what we call creating a culture of clinical trials, having people understand, having the community understand what a clinical trial is, what differentiates being in a clinical trial from just getting regular clinical care. Why are there inclusion criteria? What do inclusion criteria mean? Why do we have to have a placebo? Why do we have to travel to a study site? If I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I love my mitochondrial disease doc who's local, why do I have to travel 3 states away just to be in a clinical trial? These are all realities of clinical trials that are things that as we do more trials and the community has a better understanding of all these things, it makes a trial more understandable, and it helps create a culture of understanding these things. And then hopefully that leads to greater interest in participation and ease of participation. Also, having an aggregated community allows us to better inform patients and families about clinical trials. Having, the UMDF has done incredible work in making sure that we have ways through their website, through email blasts, letting people know clinical trials exist. Clinical trials are out there. You can participate in clinical trials. Every year at the symposium, and this year's symposium is coming up in a month, virtually at the end of June, there's presentations by companies and researchers doing clinical trials. It allows us to share information about trials and get people interested and get questions answered. And the other thing is that it's not just about patients and the families, it's also about the clinical study sites and the physicians participating in clinical trials. They need to get that experience as well and understand that conducting a clinical trial is a very regulated undertaking. There are very strict guidelines about how you perform a clinical trial and record keeping that has to be done by the physicians, by the nurses, by the pharmacy, all very detailed things that don't come natural to you. In my medical school training, in all my training, 7 years of training, no one teaches you how to do a clinical trial. And really, it just comes with experience. And that experience is really important and is an important part of this culture of clinical trials. Next, lesson 7, engaging with regulatory authorities early and often. It's really important that we also see the FDA and the EMA in Europe as our partners, because they are. They're in this with us. If we're not all aligned and working together, it's going to be really hard to get drugs through a clinical trial process and get them approved. And having frequent interactions with the regulatory agencies also is an education opportunity for them to teach them about mitochondrial disease, because they may not have a lot of experience in mitochondrial disease. It's also important to talk to different regulatory agencies, and we've seen this before, that the US FDA may have different opinions than the European EMA. And if we're going to do a clinical trial globally, like we're doing now and we've done before, you're going to want to understand those differences, because if we're going to do all this work and get the community involved and participate in clinical trials, we better make darn sure that we're doing everything possible to ensure the success of that trial. And if the trial is successful, we want to be darn sure that we can get the drug approved, because that's really the goal here, right? Is to get the drug approved and get patients therapies that they really need. And of course, having an engaged regulatory authority also helps with getting important input on a study design, on the endpoints, and also understanding who the drug could ultimately be approved for. And finally, regulatory agencies globally have a number of different programs for rare diseases that help in developing drugs for these rare diseases, help accelerate programs, because they have an understanding that there's a lot of patients who have no real good therapeutic options. And so they're really invested in helping to make programs as successful as possible. And then finally, all of these challenges are exacerbated by disease rarity. I think if we were having, a million patients with, mitochondrial disease like there are with Parkinson's disease, we could think about strategies to dealing with these challenges just by having more people available to participate in trials. We can select very small groups and still have a lot of patients. If we start thinking about smaller groups or smaller populations within a particular mitochondrial disease subtype, we're talking about really small numbers of people to be in a clinical trial. And when you do a clinical trial, you need to have at least some number of patients that allows you the best chance, what we call statistical power. That's the best chance mathematically of having a successful trial. And so we don't have that ability to make that trade-off of having a small group. Alternatively, it may also take us a longer time to enroll a trial if we want a small group. And so these trade-offs of understanding how do we deal with the rarity of disease are very real for us when we design a trial. The other part is there may actually be a number of patients who have a specific mitochondrial disease that would benefit from a particular therapy. But getting to a study site may be really hard. It requires a lot to get to a study site, especially if an individual's in a wheelchair and needs assistance of the family or has a portable ventilator. It may take 2 or 3 family members just to get one person to a study site. That's a huge commitment. It's a huge commitment to do it once, but how about doing it many times over the course of a year in a clinical trial? And so this really may limit who could actually participate in a clinical trial. Now, I do want to say that I think one lesson we learned in COVID is that a lot more can be done remotely using video conferencing. And that's something we're doing in our trials, and I think is going to be done more and more in clinical trials, which is allowing remote study visits that really can help get more people involved in clinical trials and reduce that burden of having to travel to study sites. So in conclusion, obviously there's a significant number of challenges to developing drugs for mitochondrial disease, and we have made a tremendous amount of progress over the past decade, which is incredible. And we still have many challenges to go. It's important to realize that this is a team effort of all stakeholders, and that it's only through this partnership of families, patients, patient advocacy groups, physicians, researchers, the FDA, companies. It's only through that collaboration and partnership that we're going to be able to have a successful development. And until we're able to meet all those items on the checklist for an ideal attribute for a drug development program, we should continue to push forward. We should continue to try to develop therapies and get people the therapies that they need. But let's make sure we make learnings along the way. And let's make sure we learn from each other's experience. I always tell my team, I don't mind making mistakes, but let's not make mistakes we've made before. Let's make sure we take the learnings that we've made, put them in place, and let's share them with each other. We're all in this together. People often wonder, you're with PTC, do you really want to share your learnings with other companies? Absolutely, we do. We're all in this together. And we all learn from each other, and we all share in each other's success. And the ultimate goal is to get as many approved therapies as possible for patients with mitochondrial disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. You really covered a lot of ground there, and I'm glad we have a little bit of time left here in the hour to kind of talk about some of the key messages inside of there, and really, what are the take-home messages, right, for our patient community here, and maybe we could start with, where do you feel like in the mitochondrial disease space we've made the most progress in the past decade? Are there any specifics there that you can kind of point to, or places where we've made the most progress?
So I think we've made progress, Phil, in so many places. I mean, one, we're doing this, right? We're talking about, and at the symposium for the past several years, we have clinical trial panels and discussions and half days, sometimes full days to talk about clinical trials. I think that's really, really important. I think if we just look at the mere number of clinical trials going on now, that's a hallmark of success,
sure.
Right? That's really important. The UMDF participated and helped lead in March of 2019 an externally led patient drug development day with the FDA. That was a huge undertaking led by UMDF and in collaboration with a number of other groups to get to the FDA and teach them about mitochondrial disease. That's a huge marker of success. Those are, and when you do it, one, it was a lot of work. It was incredibly important work. And you realize, oh my God, how did we not have this before?
Right.
and you go and you talk to the FDA. It was really such a great day. And you realize how much we taught them. And it's like, if we didn't do this, if we didn't have this before, how could we actually have a dialogue about what it takes to get a mitochondrial drug disease approved if they've never seen a patient with mitochondrial disease before?
And quite often when you're in the fog of war, and I think for those of us in the disease community, a lot of times that's how you think about living with a rare disease. It's hard to kind of put your head up and look around and say, okay, we've made real progress here. And it's important to note those advancements and then build off of them. And the patient-focused drug development meeting, as you said, I think was a really key one. It certainly, I think you and I both know, opened some eyes at the FDA, right? With regards to, we already knew this was a challenging disease for any sponsor that's going to come to us and hope to develop a drug, but a better understanding of the burden of the disease, right? And what our patient community is really looking for in terms of idealized treatments. So maybe, if you could comment just briefly on, the FDA has changed, it's evolved, somewhat, maybe in the past decade, maybe a little bit longer than that, but it's a much more patient-focused agency than it was back in the day. And maybe you could just comment on some of those changes.
Yeah, I think it's true. There's been an incredible effort. Look, if you're going to evaluate a drug and you're going to tell us to get a drug approved, we have to show you how a drug impacts how an individual feels or functions in everyday life with their disease. How do you do that if you don't know how a patient feels or functions in everyday life?
Yeah, but there was a time when that was the approach, right? They really weren't thinking about it from the patient.
Right. And I could tell you, we had a conversation with the FDA. I remember clear as day, April 29th, 2011. Had a conversation with the FDA about a rare mitochondrial disease. And the agency clearly had no experience with that disease. And they said, you don't have good natural history. We're going to treat this disease like a much more common disease where there's millions of people.
Yeah.
That was their answer. It was our job to come with the natural history. And in the absence of that, we're going to treat you like a common disease, which is nothing like the mitochondrial disease subtype. That's terrible. And that's really evolved. And look, we've all evolved. I think there's, and I don't mean to cast, the agency's not the bad guy. They're our partners. Yeah. And we have to do a better job of giving them the information. Sure. But I do think there's been a lot of outreach, and orphan disease, the Orphan Drug Act that was passed in the 1980s was the beginning. The work that UMDF has done, groups like NORD have done in collaborating with the agency has been tremendous. They want to help as a company. They want to help us. They want to hear from patients. They want to know what things are like. Their whole, and they exist to get therapies to patients and protect and make sure that they're safe and effective.
That's really the key in the end, isn't it? That's the charge of the FDA, right? Is to really only approve those drugs which have been proven to be safe and effective. It's never black and white, is it? Right? Efficacy data, safety data, there may be different perspectives on it. The patient voice can really make the difference, right? This has been demonstrated in other disease communities that strong voice about why this is important to us, how this is helping us to feel, function better, to thrive, can make the difference in an approval.
Yeah, there's no question. And understanding why things matter. Why it matters in my mitochondrial disease, what being able to do, having, a small amount more energy each day, what that actually means to me. What does it mean to my life if I'm actually able to be out of a wheelchair for X amount of hours a day? It may only be one more hour to you, but in that 1 hour, I can do so much more.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Matt, lots more, I think, for us to talk about. I do want to make sure that we get to some of the questions that have been submitted here as well. And I'm going to take this opportunity just to remind everyone, please, if you have a question, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and submit a question. We'll do the best we can to get to that tonight. There was a question asked, which I thought was really interesting, right? Could research trials focus more internationally to get numbers up? And I think, clearly international trials are a big part of an overall clinical strategy, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're doing that now. So we have an ongoing trial with vatiquinone, previously known as EPI 743, in kids with mitochondrial disease and seizures. And that's a trial we're doing globally. We have a number of sites up and running in the US and sites in Europe. We're also looking in Japan and also possibly Australia. So it's a great idea, and it's something we're really doing. And also on the patient advocacy side, I think what's really great is there's so much more collaboration globally.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
and we have
initiatives.
Sure. And we have initiative. We're all, Phil and I, we're both involved in the Leigh syndrome roadmap project, which is helping address many of the challenges in developing drugs for Leigh syndrome. That's an international who's who of patient advocacy groups, physicians, and that global collaboration is what we really, really need.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case. And, mitochondrial disease can be thought of as collectively, right, a collection of rare diseases, but many of the individual forms are ultra rare, with very low prevalence rate. We have to turn over every stone in every country, right, to try to find the patients. So that question really hits the nail on the head, right? We have to think and work globally, right, to solve these problems. And we're very fortunate to have strong partners in the mitochondrial disease community that are all have the same goal to try to help the patients. Maybe a question to vatiquinone, since you brought it up in the trial that you're currently conducting. There was a question asked about, at the conclusion of that study, will participants have the option to remain on it? So the classic open label question, has that been decided, or will participants have to be completely taken off the drug?
Yeah, great question. So that the study design is, so really the goal of the trial is to look at the effects of vatiquinone on number of seizures. So there'll be a 6-month period where you'll receive either placebo or vatiquinone, after which everyone will get vatiquinone for another 18 months. So that everyone is guaranteed to get at least 18 months. It's been our practice to continue patients on drug after a trial concludes. Now, it's always hard to say definitively today how that happens because it depends on a lot of things, but it's traditionally been our practice to continue trials and keep patients on drug.
Yeah, well, great. That's great to hear. And I think it's a message to the patient community that, be engaged, be involved in this, and know that you will have an opportunity in this specific case to receive the drug, regardless of how you're randomized inside the trial. You've mentioned a couple of times this culture of clinical trials, and this is something we spend time inside UMDF, talking about and talking to key stakeholders like yourself and others about, how do you build a culture of clinical trials? And again, with the length of time you've been involved with it, I wonder if you could just speak a little more to that, about what that means to you in terms of creating a culture of clinical trials for mitochondrial disease.
Yeah, I think it's, again, a team effort, right? We all have to bring something to the table. And when I think about it, it's a way of all of us thinking about clinical trial participation as a key component of what we do.
Right.
As mitochondrial disease center, so as physicians and medical facilities, we want to be involved in trials. Trials are important. It's a way, our physicians have time to do the trials. We have coordinators who can help do trials. As in an advocacy group, we talk about clinical trials. We have webinars. We have parts of our website dedicated to clinical trials. At our meeting every year, we talk about clinical trials. We showcase clinical trials. We let people who trust us, the patients and families who trust us, we let them know that we think they're important. And then in terms, and by the way, clinical trials are not for everyone. It's an individual choice. They have their freedom, and each one's maybe better suited to others than or not. Some may be better suited for some people than others, and that's an individual decision. But I think we would love to be at the point where people are at least asking,
Right.
are there any clinical trials going on? And look, part of that, I said, is our responsibility as an industry. We have to do the trials.
Right.
I mean, no one's gonna say, hey, is there a clinical trial for me? And if the answer is always no, then why would they be interested?
Right.
I think we also have to do a better job, again, including myself. We have to spend more time explaining what a clinical trial is. We use terms that are very clear and meaningful to us, like endpoints, like phase 2, like phase 1, like placebo. You know, if you want people to participate, they've got to understand what that means in their language. And so
it's a really good point, right? Like we all have a responsibility to be educating each other, helping each other, informing about what the key steps are, how you can be engaged. Ultimately, it is, of course, a personal decision on how any individual decides to be engaged, but be engaged. And I think we often talk about clinical trials in particular, equally as important for those in the future and honoring those in the past as it is for trying to help yourself or a loved one in your family. Of course, that's a top priority, but all of these things come together, right? And then we start to stack the bricks on top of each other, and that's how we can have success with developing treatments and cures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there was another question that came in, and this may have been specific to the vatiquinone study that you just described before, but I think it's a good question just in general about clinical studies for our audience to understand. How many times does a patient have to go to a clinical trial site to participate in a study? Because that's highly variable. What are some of the factors that impact that decision, Matt?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when you think about a clinical trial in general, right? So there's a set of criteria that people have to match to get into the trial. There's a number of reasons. They could be related to safety, it could be related to the disease, it could be related to the drug. And typically there's a first visit when you go to the site. That's a really important visit where, first of all,
right?
Yeah, and it's also you get to know the doctor who's evaluating you, and you get a bunch of tests done to make sure everything's okay, that it's safe for you to be in the trial. And they tell you about how to take the drug. Our drug is taken with foods 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, dinner. So that's good to know, right? Mm-hmm. What kind of things do I have to do being in a trial? So you get all that information at that first visit. And then those endpoints that we talked about, the ways that we determine whether or not a drug's working, we usually do a whole bunch of them at the beginning, so we know where you are, so we know if you got better, if you stayed the same, if you got worse. So we do all those kinds of things. Then it's important to check in periodically to check on safety, check on progress, give you more drug if you've run out of drug. Usually, if you have a 3-month supply of drug, you have to come back every 3 months. And so it varies in any individual trial how frequent that is, but usually you need to be there at the beginning and need to be there at the end for a final study visit when we're going to say, okay, this is the point we're going to say from month 0 to month 12, did you get better? So those are 2 really important points. Now, what we're doing in the middle, what we're doing, a lot more people are doing, is saying, hey, is there a way we can save that trip to the study site in the middle? I think that's really important for families affected by mitochondrial disease. I often say it takes a village just to get to a single visit. To do it many times if it's far away is really hard. We also know, by the way, that travel to the study site can actually impact the way you do on these endpoints. So there's a lot of motivation to do it. And I think, if you want to say that sometimes opportunities come out of crises, I think COVID has taught everyone that there's a lot more we could do remotely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm convinced that's the new normal is going to involve more of that remote assessment, whether that's in practice of care in general with a primary care provider or in the context of a clinical trial. I do think we're seeing a fundamental shift there, and this is a positive one, right, for rare disease patients, right, for sure.
Absolutely.
So you had a great list there at the beginning of sort of the, what are the criteria that really make a disease area attractive, right, for drug development, or at least give someone active in drug development a sense there's a good chance of success here, all right? And you listed a number of them, right? How homogeneous or heterogeneous is the disease? How much natural history data? Are there objective measurements? Is the population defined? Can we access them? And of course, is there precedent? And as I thought about that, there's no question, right? We can rattle off challenges for mitochondrial disease on all those fronts, and you spoke to some of them. We've made progress against them.
Absolutely.
But I think it's also important, for our audience to understand there are many diseases in that same situation.
Oh yeah,
right. And it's more the exception to have all of those things than it is to have them ready to go.
No. In fact, in rare disease, that's really the key. It's really more so than I mean. Look, I think you can answer it the other way and say, where are there a lot of drugs approved?
Right.
Right. High blood pressure, diabetes, some cancers. Antibiotics,
Right.
And you think about those diseases and you say, wow, it's really easy to tell if someone's blood pressure got higher or lower.
Right.
Right. It's really easy to tell if someone's blood sugar got better or lower. It's really, so you're right. There's those where there's drugs or where those things exist, but there's far more diseases where there aren't treatments and those elements aren't there. But that all, and again, I think I put that up there only to say, look, that's not a reason not to do mitochondrial drug disease development. Right. Just go in eyes wide open.
Right.
Because if you go in eyes wide open, you can make all the strides we've made. Right? Let's talk about it. Let's say what the challenge is. If we pretend there's great natural history, we're never going to do natural history.
Exactly right.
So,
yeah, but you have to acknowledge the challenges and then devise the plans, right, to take them on. And I know one of the big challenges that we've faced in this community because of that heterogeneity is getting to a confirmed genetic diagnosis.
Yeah.
Could you kind of speak to the changes you've seen, right, over the past decade and just the ability to get to a confirmed genetic diagnosis and why that's so important in the context of a clinical trial? We always get questions of, I don't have a genetic diagnosis yet. Can I participate in a clinical trial? Maybe you could speak to that briefly.
Yeah, it's really, there's a lot there, by the way, and it's really important because I do know a decade ago, for example, there were more patients without genetic confirmation than with. And now I think it's going, I often ask, is it that an individual doesn't have a genetically confirmed mitochondrial disease? Is that because a mutation hasn't been found or they haven't really tried, or is there really no genetic basis? And I think more and more we think it's a matter of we just haven't found the mutation yet.
Right.
The reason it's important is when you do a clinical trial, it's a really well-controlled, regimented environment.
Right.
And we have to be able to say that we're sure that every patient in that trial has the mitochondrial disease. That's important as well because if we have a drug that we think only would work in a mitochondrial disease, we've got to be sure that that's what's causing, for example, in our trial, seizures, right? If you have a different syndrome that's causing your seizures, that we're not sure the drug works in, well, it's not good for you to be in the trial. You can imagine other trials for other drugs where the safety profile could be different if you actually have the drug. So you really want to know and that check the box that this is in fact the disease.
Yeah, well, as you said in your presentation, absent that kind of rigor, you really risk, running a trial and then having to repeat a trial and then having to repeat it again. And obviously the timelines just stretch out and you may never get to the therapeutic you want.
Yeah.
Taking the time to define the population, apply that kind of rigor to this is the group we're going to study. Success will then bring the chance to explore other populations and other ways to for the patients to be able to access those drugs. So, and it's a reminder again, I think, to a patient advocacy group like UMDF, like we have to think in our mission about what can we do to help them. A large percentage, right? Upwards of half of our patient community don't have that confirmed genetic diagnosis. What can we do to help those patients that are on the diagnostic journey, as it's often referred to, to get to that confirmed diagnosis and have the opportunity then to participate in a clinical trial? We're giving a lot of thought to that right now. And I think by the time symposium rolls around at the end of June, we'll have some exciting programs to discuss with everyone about ways we can help on that front too. I see we're starting to get close on the hour. I wanted to, maybe end with, let's look a little bit into the future. What does the future hold? All right. And, again, thinking about that checklist and getting to a precedent, right? And let's imagine a world, right, where, that first drug has gotten across the goal line and there's a label for an approved mitochondrial disease drug. What do you think the impact of that will be going forward? Maybe look out a few years, and then I don't know how good your crystal ball is, but maybe 5 to 10 years, and you just share some of your thoughts there because you've been so active in this space.
Yeah, I dream of that day. We all do, right? I think one thing we can say, Phil, is that clinical development, getting a drug approved, takes far longer than any of us wanted to.
Yep.
And I think we also know, and it's hard to swallow, that there's, as much as there's promise and successes, there's failures. And there's things that don't go well. And I think, again, part of that culture of clinical trials is understanding the up and down nature of clinical development. But
off the horse, get back on. Right?
And that's what we have to do. That's the only way we're going to get there. Yeah. There's very few challenging things in life you ever get the first time.
Right.
You end up working for it, learn some lessons, scrape your knees, get back on the horse, keep going forward, and keep your eyes on the finish line. Keep your eyes on success, because it's so important. And so I do think we can, I can say I look to the future and I see many approved therapies. I think, when we get that first one, and you and I have talked about this, and I think the community is waiting for that first one, because on the other side of that first one, a lot happens. A lot of good things happen. One is there's now a precedent. Right. Other people can follow that model, right? The agency knows what it looks like to have an approved therapy. That's really, really important. And by the way, other drug companies are going to say, I want to have one of those too.
Investment is
it's a reward. It's not something that, there's no chance for success. Because a big company, if we look at who's in mitochondrial disease development now, it's a lot of small companies. A big company has that checklist. They take that checklist really seriously.
Of course.
And then also just, the excitement of that, the prospects of that. I just think the halo effect of those first successes is going to be tremendous throughout the community, throughout the research community, the physician community. It'll be terrific.
Wow, it's particularly important, again, for something as complex as mitochondrial disease. We're not going to have a silver bullet drug, right? There's not going to be one drug that's going to be able to help all population, all ages, mildly affected, severely affected. We're going to need a lot of different approaches, different mechanisms of action, different intervention types. And that first one just opens the door, right? Then for all the others, right, to come. And then you hope that there's really a suite of opportunities, right, for our mitochondrial disease patients to access drugs that are meaningful to them. I think that's our ultimate goal.
And that's truly how we look at it, right? We look at this as, the first of many, and then from one you go to more. And actually, the second and third are always easier than the first.
Yeah. Well, Matt, can't thank you enough for sharing your time, your insights. We're really fortunate to have someone like you active in our disease community. We've all got our fingers crossed that the study that you've got open right now, we've shared some of the details around the MIGHTY study in the chat box. So before we close the webinar, you might want to check that out. If you think you might have a loved one that could be eligible for that study. I know Matt and his team would really appreciate you taking the time to check it out and see if you could be a good candidate for it. So thanks again, Matt.
Thank you, Phil.
Thanks to everybody that joined us tonight. And we will look forward to joining you again as we get closer to symposium with 2 Ask the Mito Doc panels. So again, thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.